to Jennifer Gardner, the Assistant Director for the Center for Black Diaspora, for whom this would never have happened if it wasn't for her. Now, this is who you came to see, Dr. Lindsay Gary. I'll do a quick intro and then I'll turn you over to her. So Dr. Lindsay Gary is a professor, scholar, conceptual diaspora artist, and Afrocentric entrepreneur whose mission is to educate, connect, and empower the African diaspora. Dr. Gary is the mother, founder of several businesses. She's the executive director of the Re-Education Project, the artistic and executive director of Dance Africana, LLC, co-director of Ade Ile Properties, and the CEO of Isigun Enterprises, LLC, which is home to Africana Book Club, Sawari Tours, Marifa Courses and Curriculum, Black Charm, Josephine and Annabelle, House of Usmare, Who Your People, Productions, Duratriv app, and Gumbo, the podcast. As an Afrocentric entrepreneur, she believes that her businesses are much more than Black owned, but have a mission to be centered on the benefit and liberation of the African community worldwide. She was born and raised on Karanqua, Akokisa, and Atacapa Ishak lands, Houston, Texas, and is an Afro-Louisian of Mandinka, Fula, Balanta, Temne, Hausa, Malagasy, Sobo, Ateke, Kota, Congo, Fon, and Muskegee Creek heritage. She conducts much of her work in her neighborhood of 3rd Ward in South Louisiana, her recent ancestral roots. Also in Philadelphia and throughout Africa and the African diaspora. She has traveled to 37 countries. So I'll turn you over to Dr. Lindsay Gary. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome and for reading the full bio. I know it's loaded, so I appreciate that. Hope y'all all having a good evening. So I'm really looking forward to sharing my research and more about my film. Thank you all so much for watching it. I hope you learned a lot. I hope you have questions because I'm looking forward to hearing those. And so we're gonna start off by just talking a little bit about my background and how I was led to the research and to the development of the film. So the research itself really started being developed deeply in about 2014, 2015, when I started my master's programs, my first couple of master's programs. And at the same time, I was looking into this research. It was from a different perspective. So we'll talk a little bit more about how that changed, up until now with the research I'm presenting. Prior to starting this as a research project, I was really looking into it as a film. So I actually started this film after watching the Black and Latin American films, a docuseries by Henry Louis Gates. And there was a particular episode on Hispaniola, the island, right, which is where Dominican Republic and Haiti are. And so after watching that, I was really blown away by how similar that information was and those experiences were to my own family roots in Southwest Louisiana, okay? And so that's really what inspired me to make that film. Now, it took me about 10 years to finish it, because actually we just finished it last year through a start and stop process, and actually my research helped re-lead me to the film itself, which I'll talk about in a second. But I am, as you heard in the bio, I'm born and raised in Houston, and Houston is really an extension of Southwest Louisiana culture. And so a lot of the things that you see culturally in Southwest Louisiana, you also see in Houston. So even though I spent a lot of time in Louisiana growing up, even if I hadn't, I would have still had access to my culture through that. And so my grandparents are all from Southwest Louisiana, And that's really how I got connected to this, because it is a part of my culture as well. And then can we get the slide? I think we'll go through a couple ones. So I want to show you a little bit about, thank you. I want to show you a little bit about this background I come from. And you see on this picture, it's a collage of some of my ancestors. And I like to start with this because this is really the reason I'm doing it. This is, you know, these are the people who led me to the work, if you will, because I never planned on studying this in a PhD program, never planned on writing a dissertation on the topic, but I definitely planned on doing the film. And so the things kind of worked alongside each other. So you'll see on all sides of my family, both my mother and my father's side, I have roots in Southwest Louisiana. So these are my ancestors. Some of them are grandparents, some of them are great uncles and aunts, and then some of them are great grandparents and great great grandparents. And so when I talk about Southwest Louisiana, this is really what I'm looking at, this area in green. So I think a lot of times when people hear about Louisiana, they automatically think New Orleans. Anybody in here? Yeah, most people do. It's no shame, but I'm not talking about New Orleans, right? So just want to be clear. If you see this part that's in lavender or purple going east, right? Right there toward the Gulf Coast, that is where New Orleans is, okay? My family is coming from this area where it says Lafayette. So it's a pretty much a ways. There's a lot of similarities, but I have to make the distinction for one, because a lot of the research is not based on the part in green that you will find. There's very little discussion on this region of Louisiana as it relates to African culture. A lot of times when we think about African culture in Louisiana, we automatically think New Orleans, we think second line, we think jazz, we think gumbo, maybe we'll talk about that in a second. But we also think of Mardi Gras, and we don't necessarily understand the connections that these traditions have to Southwest Louisiana, but also most of us have never been because it's a very rural area. And so if you go down there, it's probably because you're, you know, have family there, you know, rather than just visiting for a tourist attraction. So this area is where my ancestors are from, where I spent a lot of time growing up at, and another place where I think it's important to highlight how much Africa has contributed. And slide. So the main issue that I'm going to be looking at and that you saw in the film is that, again, the articulation of Africa is very minimal when it comes to Southwest Louisiana. There's very few researchers or scholars, very few scholars who've actually focused on this area. And if they have, it's been in the lens or through the lens of Cajun culture or Creole culture, French colonial culture. Very few people have actually looked at it through an African lens. I'm going to show you in a little bit two texts that I work primarily with, especially as I was developing my documentary toward the end, and even my dissertation project. And they're like the few who actually attributed that culture to Africa. But even then, it was still focused primarily on this southeastern region of the state rather than the Southwest. So I'm saying this to say that the contributions of Africans to Louisiana's culture are completely, in many cases, under-acknowledged or understudied. There's very little information about that. Lack of robust scholarship, but also very few people are going to interrogate the term Creole itself. That's a very touchy topic, even for my family, being from there, and the people in the community, because there's a huge fight between this idea of if the land is Cajun or if it's Creole, right? Who does it really belong to? And by, you know, separating from the term, it almost kind of undermines that debate, because now you're removing that structure of Creole, and now it's like, okay, well then that means the Cajun battle wins, right? So it's very touchy, for lack of a better term. So I'm hoping that I can touch it a little bit with my research, just a little bit, just to, you know, kind of start opening up some conversations and looking at it from a different perspective. So this research that I did for my film was really looking at all aspects of the culture. So from food to language, to music, to dance, spirituality, okay? Looking at pretty much all aspects that I could within the time frame of a film and really trying to illuminate the African roots, the foundation of those cultural characteristics. My dissertation, which, like I said, I worked on these alongside each other. The dissertation, though, is actually looking at all aspects of the culture through the lens of spirituality. Because actually, when I was working on the film, I realized spirituality was the common thread through all of the aspects. So that's why I chose to focus on spirituality as a lens to explore the rest of the culture. And I think we can go to the next one on this. Okay, so when I was working on the film, I used an Afro-ethnographic approach. So when I first started working on the film, I had a very different perspective on this whole topic. As I mentioned, I grew up in this Creole culture, and I was really trying to understand what it really meant. Because it's one thing to grow up in a culture, and it's another thing to study it. It's the difference between being Black and then being in the Black Studies department, right? It's a whole different perspective you have on who you are. And when I decided to study it on a scholarly level, I started getting, different ideas and perspectives from different theories and, written text. And a lot of what I was reading about Creole didn't resonate with me. Some of it did, but some of it didn't. And I couldn't figure out why it didn't. And it wasn't until I started studying the actual theory of Creoleness or creolite that I realized, okay, this is why it doesn't resonate with me. But more on that in a moment. So it brings me to Afrocentricity. When I started my PhD program, I was really, got the opportunity to really experience what Afrocentricity is as a theory. And it really is a perspective that centers on African agency by viewing African phenomena and experience from the lens of African people. Really, so in some, looking at things from an African perspective. That seems kind of like obvious, like, oh, of course we should look at Black things from an African perspective. But it's not as easy as it sounds. And actually, it actually takes a lot of times rewiring, unlearning, relearning things to be able to see things from a non-Eurocentric lens. And even people who may not intentionally be looking at things through a Eurocentric lens still are, and I was one of those people. And I couldn't figure out why, when I was working on this initial research, that I was having issues. I was like, something just doesn't feel right. And which is why I paused my film work, because I knew it just, something was off with the initial perspective I was taking. Slide. And so I want to talk about what the differences are, and I think that'll make it a little bit more clear. So when we look at Creoleness, there was a few scholars in the Caribbean, places like Martinique, Guadeloupe, who came up with a theory to support the idea of Creole, what it means to be a Creole. Because before that, it wasn't really articulated in a theory. It was more so, depending on where you were, how Creole was described, right? So if you're from Belize, or if you're from Mauritius, or if you're from, Cape Verde or Haiti, Creole can mean different things for you. And over time, Creole has evolved tremendously. Initially, the term Creole was referring to people who, were born in the Americas, the first generation born in the Americas. It didn't matter your race, your culture, your country of origin, or your place of origin. You were born here and your parents hadn't been, you were Creole. So you could be an African Creole, European Creole, a mixed race Creole. And so it has taken many different forms over time, right? But this theory essentially articulates that Africa is one of the many influences in Creole culture, okay? Which, can't argue with. Sounds good. You're like, okay, I'm here with you. But the part that struck me is when they underestimated, kind of underarticulated how much Africa has been influential in Creole culture. And so it was more so considered to be the exceptions. Okay, so all of this is European and all of this is indigenous, and then here's a little trickle of Africa, right? And this is how a lot of Creole theorists look at Creole culture, a lot of people who identify as Creole, this is how they associate, not everybody, but this is the association. Oh yeah, we had some people, they were enslaved. And it's just kind of like, an afterthought. And for that reason, I knew that when I actually started getting into the theory, that this is what was off, is the fact that this theory was supporting an erasure of the contributions of African people, my ancestors. The other part of Creolite is that culture was an indigenous fusion. So to a certain extent, depending on how you look at it, you can make the argument that, culture was created in the Americas. That's personally not the perspective I take as an Afrocentric scholar and researcher, because I understand cultural continuity. I understand that just because somebody has come from another place unwillingly doesn't mean that they leave everything behind them. And I think that that's something that's been a myth in a lot of our history classes and our anthropology classes and things like that, where we sometimes argue that culture was lost, but we don't understand that cultures can shift, cultures can be camouflaged, and people work hard to maintain their culture despite circumstances. Another thing we have to realize is that in trauma or traumatic situations, what do people turn to? Do they turn to something they don't know or to something they do? And I always say our ancestors turned to what they did know. If you're in a tough situation, you're gonna turn to whatever you know, call your mama, pray to God, whatever you believe in, not away from that, right? So when you really start to think about and question the narratives that have been pushed for so many years, it makes you say, maybe they really didn't lose culture. Maybe they really kept it. And maybe they kept it in new forms, because everybody knows cultures can change and shift, even if they stay in one location. If you look at Igbo culture today versus Igbo culture 300 years ago, right? If you look at what's going on in, let's say, Liberia today versus, and this, even if there wasn't colonization, right? Like even if there wasn't that colonial influence, you're still gonna see changes. That's normal. And so I think sometimes we equate those changes to being the fact that things were lost, right? Now, of course, everything didn't necessarily survive, but I think that, or in the ways that they used to look, right? But I think it's important to look deeply at how they were maintained. And that's what I'm trying to showcase with my research and with my film. And so when we look at Afrocentricity, it situates Africa as the foundation of Creole culture. When we think about the situation of Southwest Louisiana, it was very similar to what was going on in the Caribbean. I have people say, well, in the Caribbean, it was different, and these were Caribbean scholars, but they had a very, very similar circumstance to what was going on in South Louisiana, where there was sugarcane plantations, right? You know anything about sugar plantations, you know that they were the most deadly, right? You had a very short life expectancy, possibly 5 to 7 years of life working on them because they were extremely dangerous. So that meant there was a constant influx of people coming from Africa. They're constantly replenishing African people. And as they're constantly replenishing African people, they're constantly replenishing African culture, right? Especially if you're coming against your will. You're not gonna be like, okay, well, I'm going to this new place and I'm gonna leave everything. Like it psychologically doesn't work like that, you know? And I don't think we give our ancestors enough credit for expressing their agency in various ways. And so Afrocentricity showcases how Africa was the root, and it's actually consistent with the history and being in the circumstances being that, you know, these populations were a lot of times replenished. And for those that weren't, depending on what part of the South they were in, even in some cases in Louisiana, their families were kept together. Okay, so a lot of times we're taught that, you know, families were broken up, and this is the case in certain parts of the South. But in Southwest Louisiana, the enslavers worked very hard to keep families together because at one point they actually had to stop the trade coming from the continent, and so they had to actually encourage reproduction. So they allowed people to build families. Not to mention that many of the people who were coming into this part of Southwest Louisiana were coming from the same groups, primarily coming from Senegambia, which is present day Senegal and Gambia. So you have people that are speaking, if not the same language, mutually intelligible languages. So you have again, this culture that's consistent in the region, which has greatly influenced what we know as the Creole culture today. Thank you. And Afronography is a method of recording and writing the African experience from an Afrocentric perspective. So I use Afronography to fill in a lot of gaps. When I was conducting the research for the film and for the dissertation itself, there were very few written sources about this topic because it's really understudied. So I did a lot of interviews of family members and culture bearers and other community members to really get their perspectives on the culture. And the unique thing about this is that they were from the community. A lot of research, if you read it, it's coming from people who are not Creole or a part of this community. So it was uniquely coming from those people. And I was analyzing their thoughts through, and their sharings through an Afrocentric perspective. So it wasn't like people were like, oh yeah, we African and proud. It wasn't like that. Some people were just talking. Oh, we go to the garden and we, grow this crop, okra, or, we go to the bush and we get this monglier. So I had to analyze what they were saying and contextualize it from an Afrocentric perspective. Now, there were some people that I interviewed who were like, yeah, we know it's African, but very few of them were actually consciously aware that their culture was African. So I had to be the one to kind of like contextualize that information for them. So looking at these two texts, you're gonna see that these are the two that I primarily work with outside of the, Afronographic research. So you're gonna have Africans in colonial Louisiana and then Buki Fake Gumbo, which are, to me, gems. I came across Africans in colonial Louisiana, I don't even remember how, but that book is important because it talks about the African influence in South Louisiana. That's really, from what I've read and seen, the most comprehensive exploration of that, particularly in the colonial period. And then the second one is going to be Buki Fay Gumbo. So Dr. Ibrahim Masek was a student of Gwendolyn Midlow Hall, and he added a different element because he's from Senegal. And so he was able to make direct connections, even in the present contemporary times, to Louisiana and Senegambian culture. So I basically built on that research, but applied it to the region of Southwest Louisiana, because both of these were primarily focused on Southeast Louisiana. All right, so I think I'm checking time to make sure I'm good. Okay, I'm good. So when I did the documentary, as I mentioned before, I focused on all aspects of culture, and I didn't really have a full understanding of exactly what I was looking for when I began about 10 years ago. But when I decided to pick the research back up in 2019, I knew exactly what I was looking for. So I was asking questions like, what do you cook? What do you eat? How do you celebrate? Just blanket questions like that. And I pretty much let people share. And you will be surprised. Well, you saw the film, so you saw the types of things they were sharing. How do you worship? What is your spiritual practice? And then I would ask them after they said all those things, just about their Creole culture. I would say, do you know if any of these things are African? And most of them would say, no, I don't know that they are. I know that my ancestors were slaves. That's what they would say. But they didn't know that any of those things connected to Africa. See, in Southwest Louisiana, there's a major campaign, as Jennifer brought up earlier, to erase the contributions of African people in the state and to really call these things French, Cajun, and Creole. Now, in some cases, in many cases, actually, Creole is associated with the Black people. So if they're looking at Creole in that particular definition of it, they don't give that credit to Creole culture. If they're looking at Creole as a French culture, they do. Does that make sense? So it depends on what definition they're using. Now, when it comes to Cajun, raise your hand if you've heard of Cajun. You heard of Cajun gumbo, crawfish? Yeah. What if I told you none of that was Cajun? People grabbing their pearls in the back, right? Right. Because think about it, Cajun people are French people, right? They are French people from France who in the colonial period, right, the 1700s, moved to Canada, Nova Scotia, most of them, right? Settled there. They were banished by the British. You know, they were British and the French were fighting over all types of territory in the new world, right? They sent them down the Atlantic seaboard. Many of them came to where their French brothers and sisters were in Louisiana, right? And guess who was already there? African people, right? So the Creole or the African presence predates that of the actual Cajun people, for one. For two, what they associate with Cajun was already there when they got there, right? Acadians, Acadian is where the term Cajun comes from. A lot of those cultural customs, not all of them, but the ones that we most associate with Louisiana were already there before Cajuns came. And they weren't brought by the French colonists, right? So it's important to understand those distinctions and to know that the African people contributed a lot of what we call French and Louisiana tradition or Southern tradition is really African. So when we look at the spiritual complex, this is just kind of various ways of looking at African spirituality. You have primarily, regardless of tradition, wherever you are, you have things like divination, counterclockwise sacred circle dancing, ancestor reverence. You also have naturopathic medicine. And so regardless of location, what part of Africa or the diaspora, you're gonna see these things kind of overlapping, right? You also are gonna have this idea that there are 7 cultural characteristics that Malana Karenga proposed, right? The centrality of community, tradition, spirituality, of course, harmony with nature, sociality of selfhood, unity of being, and veneration of the ancestors. And actually in my research, you can see all of these elements. So a lot of times when we associate and we think about Louisiana, we think, oh, it's Southern and it's family oriented and it's these things and that things, but we don't ever think, could this have been something that Africans brought to the region? These ideas. And if you know about African culture and about African spirituality, you know that family is of the utmost importance. Elders are respected because they are pre-ancestors, right? Ancestors are themselves revered as spiritual beings, not just as people who come and gone, right? Very consistent throughout the diaspora and throughout the continent. Slide, please. So now that we've gotten all that out of the way, I want to look at the specific aspects as it relates to the research and the film in Southwest Louisiana. So I have a lot of examples. I'm not going to go through all of them, but please feel free to ask. And if you heard an earlier lecture, please feel free to ask other questions too. So I essentially looked at almost every aspect of the culture, as I mentioned before. And when I finished the film, it was early last year. I think I was just getting B-roll footage. So really the year before last in terms of interviews. But, well, no, I did a few last year, actually, early last year. Either way, the research that I developed for my dissertation was, of course, in line with the film because I used a lot of those, a lot of the information I gathered for the dissertation. But also I did a lot of research when I was in Senegal for 3 months last summer. So a lot of this has been expanded upon. So it's a little bit more detailed than it was in the film. Plus, we only have small time, for films, right? You can't be there all day watching. So when we look at the outcomes and what I found, rites of passage was very important to the culture. It marks a transition into the next stage in life. And it actually not only marks that, but also you're becoming more and more human. So in African spirituality, each rite that you go through, you become literally more and more of a human being. And you become more and more who you should be as a soul, as a spirit on this earth, okay? So each part is designed to develop that. And so I was thinking about growing up, because I grew up in this culture, and I grew up Catholic. And I thought about, okay, what were the most important things to us as Creole, Louisiana Creole Catholics? And I'm telling you, the first communion. Everybody grow up Catholic? You know about First Communion? No. First Communion, but all Catholics don't necessarily put as much emphasis on rites of passage, right? Depends on your culture and where you come from. But for us, it was extremely important. And so I was looking into why do we value these so-called seven sacraments? You have baptism, you have First Communion, you have confirmation, you have marriage, you have holy orders, you have, you know, your final rites that you get before you pass. To me, it was like, okay, so I'm really looking at African rites of passage, but through a Catholic lens at this point. Because when I started to really look at it, I was like, okay, this is very in sync with African rites of passage, literally the steps that take place. And so it brought me to the Nile Valley. So a lot of what we see in the Catholic Church of today and even of ancient times, or relatively ancient times, you're gonna see that that is greatly influenced by ancient Egypt. I'll give you one example, would be the 10 Commandments coming straight out of ancient Egypt, right? Like almost verbatim. So it's not inconsistent with African culture to a certain extent. And so when I started looking at it from that lens, I realized that my ancestors, who were not necessarily Catholic in real life, but who went to church, I believe like that, they were Catholic in, you know, on the surface, in public. It made me realize that there were probably some things that they were able to associate with what they already understood and did in Africa, and were able to bring those things into what they were already doing, right? So I think about things like Santeria, right, and syncretism, where African people were known to not be able to practice their true spirituality, and so they had to camouflage those practices, right, publicly. And so if you know that you already have this naming ceremony for a baby, okay, we'll just call it a baptism, right? We'll go along with it, okay, we go baptize, right? But we're doing our own thing. This kind of thing is consistent throughout the diaspora. And so it's a form of protection. You can imagine the danger of practicing and being who you were publicly in certain instances was not the safest choice, right? But also, I'm sure over time, people began to identify with these things because they saw the similarities with what they were already doing in their traditions. You also have celebrations. So everybody knows about Mardi Gras, right? One thing I found interesting about Mardi Gras, I think we talked a little bit about Mardi Gras in the film, was the fact that a lot of the costuming traditions have African roots. So a lot of times when we think feathers, what do we associate feathers with? Like which group of people? Who? Yeah, like Native Americans, right? But because we don't know that other cultures use those for ceremonial purposes, that's the only association most of us in this part of the world have. But there's a lot of research that showcases these same types of costuming in Congo, in the Congo region. And there's also other forms of costume that go beyond the feathers, right? But the style, and I wish I had a picture here, but the style themselves have roots in even West African carnival traditions, or even their masquerade, their masking traditions, right? So it's not just that it's Lent and we're Catholic and we have to give food up and we're gonna party. It's not just that. It's something that was already being practiced in Africa, right? Before they came to Louisiana. I want to look at boucheries. Can you go to the next slide real quick so I can show the images of boucheries? So a boucherie is a celebration of, you know, a hunt in Southwest Louisiana. And I think I mentioned this earlier, but there's again a major campaign to argue that, you know, this is Cajun land. So if you go throughout any part of South Louisiana, everything is Cajun. Anybody ever been down there? Everything is Cajun. I'm telling you, the Cajun is everything is like literally named Cajun. Even the boucherie. Now, boucherie is a French name, right? A French word. Anybody ever see Waterboy? Bobby Boucher, right? That boucher is butcher. And that's where that boucherie comes from, right? To slaughter the animal. But the tradition, though, is what is not necessarily from France, right? So this image up here is a boucherie, and it is something that was basically where the community would gather after slaughtering a hog and literally cook every single part. We have these things called crack, right? We have hog head cheese, literally, hog head. So you do the math, cheese, right? Everything was cooked. You also have boudin, which is a rice dish that's cooked in the casing from the intestines, right? So you have all these different things that are literally every part of the pig, and it was shared with the whole community, right? Everybody ate, okay? So when you talk about this tradition, you have to realize that even though the introduction of the pig was something new, many of these people in Africa some of them were practicing Islam, and they didn't eat pork necessarily, right? But on top of that, the tradition of just the slaughter and the sharing amongst the community is something that you saw in Africa. So down here at the bottom, you're gonna see a modern day picture of Tabaski, which is a celebration that's taking place here in Senegal, right? Same idea, different animal, right? There's a connection there. It's not just a Cajun thing, right? They didn't need anybody to teach them how to do that. It's something that they came with. And can we go back to the previous slide? We also have to understand that the enslaved population, the enslaved African population, they actually were brought to Louisiana for very specific purposes. So it wasn't just like, oh, okay, I like your outfit, so come on over, right? It was like, no, this population is known for their expert rice growing skills. This population is known for their cattle ranching skills, right? They were literally chosen for their expertise. And so if we look at these, oh, that's on the other side, but we'll get back to that. If you look at, I was on the other slide. Can you go back real quick? I'm sorry. If you look at the cattle ranching tradition and the trail riding tradition, that comes again from Africa. A lot of times when you see people from Southwest Louisiana, you just think, oh, they country. They're real Southern. They got their boots on, cowboy boots, not the winter boots that I'm wearing, right? They got their cowboy hats and belts and, they country. So we don't even think that has any association with Africa. We're thinking Western, we're thinking Southern cowboy. But what if I told you that those groups of people had a direct connection to West Africa? There is a family with the last name Poulard, spelled Poulard. Sounds French, but also not. You take off the D, you have Poulard, which is a group of people from West Africa, right? They're also known as Pool or Fulani, Fula. It's all the same group of people. And if you know anything about the Fula people, what do? What is their major contribution to West Africa? Well, cattle ranching, herding. That's what they do. That's what they're known for. From Guinea to Nigeria, that's what they're known for. So if you know that the Poulard people were brought to Louisiana for that purpose, and then you learn that the Poulard family, many of them are still doing this, like, maybe that's why. This is your family tradition. Because it comes from something you were doing already previously on the continent of Africa. Another thing that is important to note is the names that are still maintained. They really illuminate a lot about the people. One of the major names and last names in Louisiana, I think everybody from South Louisiana knows somebody with the last name Senegal. I know I grew up with some Senegals. Everybody knows the Senegal family. I wonder why, right? And so a lot of people have never questioned, especially those who live in Louisiana, because they just hear it. You know how it's like, I grew up with an uncle named Fish, Uncle Fish. I didn't know that was weird until I told somebody. They're like, your uncle named Fish? I'm like, yeah. They're like, and I was like, what? And I had to think about it myself, like, what's weird? Because that's how I grew up calling him. I never thought twice, right? But he loved to fish. His real name was Anthony, but he loved to fish. He fished every single day of his life until he passed, right? Somebody had to point it out to me that it was strange. So imagine if you grow up and everybody has this name, you may never question it, right? But for me, the fact that I grew up in Houston gave me a little bit of a different outlook because I was in the culture, but I was also a little removed from it because I wasn't in Louisiana and I was exposed to so many different people. And it really heightened my curiosity because I also wanted to reconnect since I wasn't there all the time. And so I started questioning Senegal. I'm like, that's like the country, right? Then you do research years later, and you're like, oh, That's why, because that's where they came from. And they've kept that surname. Senegal people, the last name, they're the Wolof people. Just like the Poulard people are the Fula people. So when you start to do the research, things stick out to you. But had I not had the Afrocentricity aspect, or really not question things from a different perspective and lens, I probably would be still making the argument. Well, I never made this argument, but there are people who do make the argument that Poulard comes from poulet, like chicken in French. I'm like, okay, I can see that. But why does everything have to be looked at from a Eurocentric perspective? Why won't you ever look at it from some other lens? And that's what I'm trying to bring about here. I even have in my own family the name Babilas, one of my ancestors, that was his first name. Had no idea what that meant. In fact, guess what they called him? On his records, a lot of his records say his name was Robert. I know, right? She looks appalled. And why? What is Robert? What's the nickname for Robert? Bob. Babilas, Bob. So he was called Bob for short. And so people assumed when they were doing these records that his name was Robert. And they just wrote Robert. But his name was Babilas, right? And Babilas is also a Fulani name, right? So it's telling me right there where he's coming from. But yeah, they call him Robert, literally. I think I didn't tell you that earlier. And can we go back to the previous slide too? So when we look at healing practices, this is was probably the hardest one for me to research because the way that the Catholic Church has functioned in Louisiana is really like trying to suppress African spirituality, even today. And so a lot of people don't publicly talk about these things. It's kind of something you just see or know, and you just don't talk about it. Like I saw a lot of things growing up, heard a lot of things. I'm like, what are y'all doing in there? But you know, you couldn't really ask. You just kind of knew it was going on, or you didn't know exactly what it was, but you knew it was something spiritual. I had a great aunt who, to this day, I don't know what she was doing, as you saw in the film in the back room. To this day, don't know what Aunt Olympia was doing, but I'm pretty sure it was something along these lines after talking to aunts and uncles later on. She was my great aunt. And so the healing practices you're gonna see are another part of that tradition. I think the part I wanna talk about before I get into trade tours is the idea of these, let me check time, good. The idea of herbalism, right? So going to a new place that you've never been, which is what they did because they were not from Louisiana. They were from Africa, various parts, in this new land, in a situation you clearly don't want to be in, but you already understand, you have the knowledge to survey the land for healing purposes. That was a tradition that was already very prevalent. You have to realize, you know, human civilization originated in Africa. And so they had a lot of knowledges from, I mean, can you imagine how many generations to figure out about divine energies, about spirituality, about how the land worked, how the stars work, right? Nobody taught them that. That's something they had to learn amongst themselves. Of course, later on, they're going to be taught, but it's something you have to develop and learn and experience. And so this is a tradition that's been passed on for many centuries. And so sometimes we don't give that credit that the knowledge was already there. We say, oh, they learned from the indigenous people. Now, while they did share things with indigenous people, we also have to really mention that they already understood land. Indigenous people all over the world understand land and how it works, even if the herbs and the plants are new to them, right? They smell them, they know how to tell based off certain properties, okay? And so this is something that happened in Louisiana as well. So you have the earth being a major source of healing. One of those major things is gonna be Monglier, which as you see up here is written, it's like the fourth word on the main paragraph, first line. Monglier, thank you. So Monglier, I don't really spell it like that, they spell it different ways, but Monglier is an herb, a healing remedy. It's something my family has been drinking for centuries. You go to the bush, you get the Monglier, make it into a tea. And apparently it heals COVID, that's what they're saying now. I haven't had to try that just yet. But it's something that has had a spike in interest because of COVID, the pandemic. And so, as I drink water, right? So anyway, mongli is one of those many herbs and healing remedies. You also have traiteurs or traiteurs who are people who help to heal. And so you would go to these so-called medicine people. They would heal you with their hands, right? They would heal you with prayer. These are things that aren't necessarily talked about, but that exist, right, in our culture. Next one, please. And we are going to take questions at the end, by the way. So let's look at, I think earlier we didn't get a chance to talk about decor and architecture. So I can talk a little bit about that, but just know that, there's a major respect for elders and a reverence for ancestors. In terms, because I know I'm running short on time, for decor, I want to talk about something we do in Louisiana. Almost every house has a Virgin Mary statue outside. And I was like, okay, interesting. That's a form of protection, right? That's a form of protection. And I'm like, okay, well, Virgin Mary, has a European look. Virgin Mary was not African. But I noticed that a lot of the Virgin Mary statues also had the baby Jesus, right? And it reminded me of the Black Madonna and the connection of motherhood and the fact that they respected women. And so a lot of Catholics have a very strong reverence for Mary in general, but not many of them have Mary placed as a statue outside of their house as a protection amulet, right? That's something that's very Louisiana. And it's something that made me really think about what are the deep connections that they have to this type of imagery? Is it just that it's a Catholic association? And I don't think so. I think it goes back to something very ancient and a respect for motherhood, a respect for the role of the woman as being a bearer of civilization, right? But also, when we look at the Virgin Mary, another thing, if you think about Oshun and how Oshun is depicted as an Orisha in places like Cuba, and how Oshun is, combined with the Virgin Mary, it makes you say, okay, there's something to this. It could have been a camouflage for their own indigenous divinity, right? Or some type of spiritual presence, feminine presence that they were, praying to, but also not praying to, okay? When we look at food and animals, we already talked about cattle ranching, but I want to talk about rice. So I mentioned that rice was a major reason that Africans were enslaved in Louisiana, because that was a major food crop and food source, and a major, honestly, cash crop for the region outside of sugarcane. And so rice was literally in the diet of many parts of West Africa that they were coming from. When I was in Senegal, I promise you we ate rice every day. Every day. And I was like, oh, this is just like how I grew up. It doesn't matter what you're eating on top. The rice, whether it's beans, whether it's gumbo, whether it's just rice, you eat like jambalaya. And if you look at a lot of these dishes, they have African roots, right? Okra itself, as you saw in the film, is the African word for gumbo, one of the African words for gumbo. I said that backwards. Gumbo is one of the African words for okra. And that is something that we contributed. So when we talk about a Cajun gumbo, it doesn't really make sense, because what does that even mean? When you really know what gumbo is, it doesn't add up. When you think about rice and how instrumental it's been to the culture, how fundamental it's to the culture, you know that comes from Africa. That's what they were eating. If you know many West Africans, today they eat rice every day. Nigerians, right? It's not just people from Senegal, right? A lot of West Africans in particular eat rice every day, okay? And if you look at one of our dishes, jambalaya, what does it look like? It looks like jollof rice. It's jollof rice, right? It's jollof rice. It's just what it is. And also thinking about the fact that a lot of the people who came into Southwest Louisiana were Senegambian, and many of them were Wolof. And knowing that is where jollof rice comes from, right? The Jollof Empire, come from Ghana. I know they got the Jollof Wars and the debate, right? But Chebojan is what it's really called. It was called jollof because that's where it originated, right? But these are the same people who populated Louisiana. So it's not a surprise that that's what we eat, right? Looking at music and dance, because I want to get into language in a second, But looking at music and dance, there's a lot of traditions we have in Louisiana as a whole. But in Southwest Louisiana, we don't do bounce, and somebody asked about it earlier. We do it, but it's not from there. Let me say that. Second line, we love that. But that's not our thing. Our thing is Zydeco, right? And Zydeco is made up of several instruments, one of them being the washboard, right? So it's when you take literally the thing you wash your clothes with, you used to wash your clothes with by hand, and you make it into an instrument, a percussive type of instrument. And this is something that was replacing drums that were not all the time allowed in the region. And this is, again, something that happened around the diaspora where African people had to create new ways to be percussive in their music. Okay, I can't have a drum, but this is the drum. This is a drum, right? Like, how can I create the same rhythms and sounds using what I have access to? And this is what we did with Zydeco. We created a whole new instrument from the washboard. So, similar to the steel pan that you see in the Caribbean with calypso, right? Same idea. I can't think of the name of the instrument in Venezuela, but they sit down, they play it's kind of like this, but it's square and rectangular. I can't think of what it's called, but same things. It's when you start to look at it through the lens of Africa, but also the lens of the whole diaspora, what we're doing in Louisiana is what many of our African people were doing in the diaspora. It's just a different manifestation of it. So while somebody may have done a steel pan, we may have done a washboard, it's still the same concept, right? In a different way. And so in looking at language, we're gonna also talk about, I'm gonna dance. So with our Zydeco music, we also have dance. So most of our traditions in music they're gonna be three things: music, dance, and the gathering in which those things take place. Sound familiar, right? You can probably put two and two together. The dance hall is the dance hall, but it's all of this and that, right? It's the music and it's the actual dance movement. Consistent, right? The sabar, in synagogue, very consistent. The music, the dance, and the gathering. And so either way, when you look at Zydeco, it's a remnant, it's a legacy, it's built on a legacy of jure. Jure were your work songs. So on the plantations, people in Louisiana didn't speak English for a long time. And so they were singing, stomping, working, singing work songs in what's known as Corivini or Louisiana Creole, not, wade in the water, because they didn't speak English unless they were people who were sent downriver from other parts of the South. That wasn't something that was being sung, right? Because most of them, my grandmother learned English when she was like 8 years old from listening to her younger brother who went to school, right? So she was born in the 20s. So you can imagine in the slavery period, there wasn't a lot of English being spoken in this region. So jure was their work songs in this part of the this part of the state's plantations, right? That led to songs being sung for people's passing, right? As I mentioned, when they become so-called dead, they're not really dead. We didn't need the Catholic Church to tell us that there was life after death. We already understood that and still do. Right? I feel like if anything, the Catholic Church has reinforced African spirituality. So, but even if we don't realize it did, right? So jure was something that if somebody passed, you would go to their house, you would bring food, and you would sing and you would clap, sing a cappella, and stomp your feet. That was the jure, okay? Later on, that's gonna become the la-la, these house dances, where you start adding things like your washboard, your pots and pans, right? Maybe a triangle, later on the accordion, right, which is a European instrument. And then those things become Zydeco. They move away from the houses and they become a part of the church dances, right? The Catholic Church, for many in Louisiana, even if we haven't articulated that or analyzed it as that, from what my research has revealed, has been more of a economic, let me say educational, before I say economic, but partially economic, but educational and social space for the people, right? A place where they can get to learn how to read, for one, to be educated, but also to, advocate for their own agency, right? They were allowed to have a little bit of power in the Catholic churches that they founded or that they were a part of. Whereas when they left those environments, they didn't have that. And so they put a lot into it, just like all Black churches, right? But the difference here is a lot of these church dances were birthed here, these church bazaars, these celebrations, where Zydeco became really popular. Because now we can have a whole party. We have a little more space than being in T-Mom and them house, right? We got a little more space to move. And so Zydeco really develops even more and obviously catches on even amongst other populations, Cajuns and the like. And then with the radio, of course, it expands even further. And I'm wrapping up in a second. I think I got like 1 minute. And so lastly, I want to mention the language, which is one of the most important articulations of a culture, is your language. How you speak, how you communicate. And our language is not just talking. Our language is really showcased through all of these other aspects, how we deal with each other, our nonverbal as well. But also what's important to note is that our language is based on an African grammar. Creole, which is also formerly known as Louisiana Creole, still somewhat known as Louisiana Creole, is a African grammar, as you saw in the film, right? It is something that is almost identical to other grammatical structures throughout the continent of Africa, the many languages there, and even the languages in the diaspora. So when you start to understand that that's how we define languages, it makes it hard for you to call the language Creole. Because the lexicon does significantly borrow and is largely French, right? But when you start to really analyze that the grammar is how we really express who we are, the lexicon is just what we've been kind of, in our context situation, forced to use. Then you start to say they kept their grammar intentionally. It wasn't like they couldn't get it, right? I think this is another expression of agency, to keep your grammar, to keep talking the way you talk. Me, I can speak proper English, but I can also get down with some Ebonics. Let's go, right? Because that's how I want to talk. Okay, that's how I want to communicate. That's how I feel comfortable. So I think we have to let go of they lost culture. They couldn't pick up the language. Those are myths, right? People know, you hear your parents, if your parents have accents or speak another language, you hear them code switch all the time. They can do it, they just don't want to do it, right? Very important. And also understanding that was how they were able to talk, how they wanted to talk privately around those who were colonizing and enslaving them in a way that they really couldn't understand. It's like, oh, they dumb, they can't figure it out. But really, no, we're not dumb. We just are speaking in code, so you don't understand what we're saying, right? When we look at the lexicon, again, people consider this language to be an endangered language. I say to a certain extent it is, because in a certain form that it exists as Corivini, it is somewhat endangered, the use of the lexicon as French. But when you start to look at the grammar, the people that speak English in South Louisiana, they still talk the same. They just use English words. The syntax, that's still the same. The structure is still the same. It's just more English words now. So if you look at it in that way, it's kind of makes you hopeful. You're like, okay, we're not losing who we are. But I think if you look at it as a Eurocentric, you're like, oh, we are losing who we are because we're losing the French part, right? But it also depends on your perspective. Lastly, I don't think I mentioned this earlier, but there's one of my favorite proverbs or sayings I did mention it, is when you're asking someone where they're from in Corvini, instead of saying directly, like, where are you from? Like you would say, like in a European language, like in Spanish. I don't speak French, I gotta use Spanish. We'll see about that. But de donde eres, like from where are you, like literally. Instead of saying something directly, they'll say, where is your umbilical cord buried? That is how you say, where are you from in Louisiana Creole. That is a philosophical point, right? That's a spiritual characteristic of the language, because it's not just saying where are you from, it's saying, where is your parent from? Where is your grandparent from? Where are your ancestors from? Because in many African cultures, the placenta and the umbilical cord are buried in what is considered to be sacred places. So if they're saying, where's your umbilical cord buried? They're asking, from where did you really come? Okay, you live in Houston, but where y'all buried that umbilical cord? You didn't bury it here down the street, right? You buried it in a place of importance. Going back to Africa and various parts of Africa, right? So to me, this signifies just how much of our culture has been maintained, and sometimes we don't even realize what it really stems from. There's even connections to this phrase in ancient Egyptian culture, going back to ancient Kemet, where the question is, where the idea is that inner Africa, so places west and south of present-day Egypt, are unconsidered and were called by the ancient Egyptians themselves, right? You can look at the hieroglyphics, placenta land. They said, this is the land of our placentas. This is from where we came. And so knowing that there's a connection back, and there are many cultures in the diaspora that do this too. It's not just in Louisiana. I don't know if people still do it that consistently anymore, but the saying is still there. And if you look it up, you're gonna see that it's called a Cajun phrase. It's a Cajun proverb. It's not a Cajun proverb, that's an African proverb. Okay, so it's really another way that we can see this. And so see the African culture. So now I gotta wrap up, but can we click the next slide? Because I think there's a little clip. You can click the next. Yes, there's a clip I wanna show. Can you click this? Okay, so I'm gonna explain it really quickly. So this, y'all may recognize her from the film, Donna Angel. She's a zydeco artist from Cypress Island, St. Martinville, Southwest Louisiana, as she would say. And she's internationally known, and she says when she goes to the big stage to perform, people call her a Cajun artist, playing Cajun music. And she says she, to this day, still corrects people to say she's a Creole artist playing Creole music. I want to say she's an African artist playing African music, but we're gonna let her make it. Either way, she's playing the accordion in the zydeco style. So if you listen, you're gonna see it's a European instrument, but the way that she's playing it is not in a European way. So we'll go ahead and end with that. So I really love to end with that because that you couldn't really hear it super well, but this song is saying that she's going home, you know, and that song was written by Clifton Chenier, who's a zydeco legend. And he talks about, you know, going back home to his mother, to Louisiana. And it always makes me think about going back home to Africa and really understanding how the things that we're seeing and longing for, I think subconsciously are a little bit farther over in the world. So thank you so much. I didn't do so bad on time either. So I think we're gonna take questions. We're gonna take Q&A.
So thank you, Dr. Gary, for sharing your phenomenal research. on Louisiana Creole culture and its connection to the African diaspora. So right now, we'll be taking questions right now. If you are attending virtually, please share your questions in the chat and then we will relay them to Dr. Gary. We'll start with in the room. Does anyone have a question? We have, oh, sorry, just 1 second.
Y'all don't be shy. That's why some of y'all
We have a question to the left.
question first.
This is kind of, maybe this is going off on a little bit of a tangent, but just as someone who's, I guess seen, Daughters of the Dutch by Judy Dash. This is maybe a weird question, but like what other films, when you're filming this documentary, like what films were in your head when you were, I guess trying to portray all these cultural angles, especially from an Afrocentric view?
Yeah, I love Julie Dash. I love Daughters of the Dutch. It's one of my favorite films. So thank you for that question. I think my biggest inspiration initially was definitely the Black and Latin America docuseries by Henry Louis Gates. I think I may have mentioned it here. I've been talking all day, so I don't know if I mentioned it. But it's, the island of Hispaniola episode on Haiti and Dominican Republic. I was really inspired by that because it felt like the debates that we have in Louisiana. Well, not even a debate directly. It's kind of an internal conflict, amongst community members and individuals within themselves. This idea that in some instances we're African and we're, actually very few. Let me backtrack. Some instances we're Black, right? And we're proud to be Black. And I think that reminded me a lot of Haiti, as it was portrayed in that film, the docuseries. But you have a lot of other people who don't necessarily identify with being Black as much. And if they do, it's only kind of because they have to, if you will, historically. They were kind of forced into that role when I didn't mention the American influence in Louisiana, but in 1803, when the Louisiana Purchase, Louisiana, the entire territory, so not just present-day state of Louisiana, becomes a part of the United States, doubling the size of the country. And it actually greatly influences the Louisiana region and not only diversifies the enslaved population, where many people are coming from other parts of the South who are English speakers, kind of a different cultural manifestation, but also there's going to be kind of a tension between, Americans and those who were like French colonial people and Cajuns. You have a, different cultural manifestation there. And so because of that situation, you're going to have varying understandings of like who people are, where they fit into society. And when the Americans come, they're going to really be interested in a racial dichotomy of Black and white, where it didn't really exist like that prior to. You had, Black, white, and other in Louisiana, when other was primarily people of mixed race. And they fell into a category above those who were darker skinned. And when I say mixed race, I mean not even necessarily mixed, but just lighter skin. And so a lot of times that middle class, like that middle section where it's like free people of color, not all of them were free, but those who were free people of color and lighter, a lot of times were the ones considered to be Creole. And even coming back to today, some of those descendants, they are Creole. They don't consider themselves a part of the Black population. So that reminded me a lot of the Dominican Republic, where you see people who like my complexion saying they weren't Black. And I'm like, okay, what world are you living in? That's what I was thinking. And I've encountered, this is no shade to Dominicans, right? But I've encountered Dominicans like that, and I've asked them questions, and they've been like, well, I'm not Black. That's not what they call themselves, right? Because of this kind of varying understanding of how their particular region of the island was colonized, both by kind of so-called Latin Europeans, right? Or Latin-speaking Europeans. But either way, you have, because of that, just a lot of variations in kind of perspectives amongst the community. And I really felt inspired by that Black and Latin American documentary because it signified to me the types of ideas and thought processes of Louisiana. So it was like 2 different countries on one island. And I was like, oh yeah, that's Louisiana. There's very few people in Louisiana. Well, I would say now it's shifting, but typically very few people in Louisiana really acknowledge having African roots. And if they do, it's almost like an afterthought and it's something to be proud of. It's something that many people are ashamed of and don't know much about. So that made me think about the Dominican Republic in that film. But I do love Julie Dash, and I do love another film, Sankofa. What's his name? Haile Garima. I love those 2 films. They're from the same kind of class of filmmakers. And I hope to, make future films that, kind of allude to some of those themes that they have of liberation and spiritual freedom in the future films. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I love that film. Oh, sure. Y'all want me in a high chair?
Yeah, I can see you.
Oh, okay. That makes sense.
Do we have another question from the audience?
I'll ask, coming from a Catholic faith tradition,
A Catholic what tradition?
a Catholic faith-based.
Oh, faith-based, okay.
Religious church. I guess in your understanding of spirituality, what kind of creation are you finding in your filmmaking process? Like, I don't know, what way did the spirit hit you to make that film? Does that make sense? Was it the technical aspect of the research lead you to want to visually create something, or was it to get that narrative out? Or was it more so like you just had everything, you were just like, I had to do it? Does that make any sense?
Oh, okay. I think I follow. Let me know if I'm not. But thank you for that. So when I initially started, so I had just graduated undergrad, like almost 10 years ago, and over 10 years ago now. And I was just watching the film, and it just struck me, like, you have to do a film about Louisiana. It was like right in the moment. I don't know if that was somebody's ancestor, my ancestor, somebody's spirit. I don't know what it was, but I knew I had to make a film, and I had no idea how to make a film. I didn't study film in school. I studied history, dance, business, law, everything but film. But I knew I had to do it, so I don't know if that was, God's calling me or spirit, whatever it was, but I took it. I took it as you have to do it, like no turning back. So I just started doing it. I didn't know what I was doing. I had to figure everything out, try to get help from many people along the way. But it was really, throughout the period, I was really, when I wanted to give up, and when I was kind of getting overwhelmed with, because sometimes, people didn't want to be in the film. Like, I would reach out to people and ask to interview them. They didn't want to be interviewed, or I would just have trouble with, tech issues or just so many different obstacles along the way over the years. And my ancestors kept me going. I mean, that's really what it was. I knew that I was here to give them voice because in the present, we're still fighting a major fight of erasure, of racist erasure in Louisiana, all around the world, as you see, you turn on the news, right? And I knew that I had to speak for them and tell their stories and really talk about their culture. Because if I didn't, I don't know if anybody was going to do that, So that thought process, even when I was working on my dissertation, that kept me going. Because if your dissertation ain't nothing to play with. So I was like, ooh, I don't want to do this. I don't want to open another book, read another text. That really was my motivation, even beyond me. I was like, yeah, I don't really care if we get it done at this point, but that I knew I had to tell the story on their behalf. So did that answer your question?
A lot of them, yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay, I was like, did I answer it? Okay, good. Thank you. Did you have another one? Okay, thank you. Didn't you have a question earlier too? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a question, I guess. It's more so, I guess, thoughts just while you were speaking. Because I find your journey through your work work very interesting because it starts off where it's somewhere personal. I think like the best work usually starts off somewhere personal because it allows the story to take its own journey. And obviously it's a journey of ancestry. And that becomes difficult sometimes when you're working with Black people. There's that ability to even know what your past journey within you is has been blocked off due to the inability of access to records due to the effects and consequences of slavery overall. So for someone like myself, I know that I have Caribbean ancestry from somewhere. We say St. Kitts and Nevis, I've been there times, but it's still difficult for me to even connect myself to that ancestry. Especially like I went to white schools my whole life. I grew up in Detroit, Michigan, which is a very white city, lots of Black history there. Played soccer. I used soccer and that was like my vehicle to explore African diasporic history, especially in continental ways as this is like a political tool, a tool for unification. But where I sometimes hit a wall is the fact that I don't know where I'm from. The only thing that I have to depend on is, I guess, my African Americanness or my Blackness or my Americanness at the end of the day when it comes to that. So that's why I said I don't really know if it's a question, it's kind of just a thought. But like, do we all have to know where we're from? In the sense of, is it even possible?
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. That's a really good question and, comments overall. I think I'll start with me. So I know that I grew up in a family that was very adamant of passing down family history. So I can never take credit for everything that I know. I've built on a lot of things that I already had a foundation for in terms of family history. So, for example, I think I was mentioning earlier that my aunts gave us a big family history book. So my aunts are genealogists. My grandfather was one. I got my first genealogy book, like to document my own history as a member of the family when I was about 6 years old. My grandpa gave me all kind of genealogy software. I sat down. I was raised by my parents, but I grew up where we lived. It was like a family home. So it was my mom, her mom, my father, and my sister. So I grew up a lot with my grandmother. Like when my parents were at work, my grandma would just talk to us like we were friends on the porch. So we learned a lot of family history that way because she talked to us about it. And I realized everybody didn't have that. And I understand that that can be frustrating. But I also want to lift up that I did have it because there are people who have it and don't take advantage of that. And so if you have people who, and I'm gonna get back to your point in a second, but if you have people in your family who are willing and able to talk, are you listening to them? Are you listening? Are you respecting them? Because there's a proverb that one of my friends says, he's from Ghana. He says, our elders are our libraries. Our elders are our libraries. So if you have that, please don't take it lightly. And I didn't really have a choice as a kid to listen, but I also was very intrigued and I was very curious. So I did have that. I would also say there's sometimes, in terms of our research process, a lot of roadblocks we can find. So even though I had a great start, there are still some things that were really frustrating for me in terms of that family secrets are a thing. That's real. So you may grow up thinking somebody, that ain't your daddy, that ain't your mama, that's somebody, you know what I mean? Like that's real. Like I've encountered, well, my parents are my parents, but I've encountered that in my line. Or I found that sometimes when I'm doing my research, I was always hitting a roadblock. My big thing was trying to connect to Africa. And I can go back super far on most of my lines, all the way to the 1730s, okay? Sometimes even earlier than that in my own family tree. But guess where it's taking me back to? Europe. Europe. That is infuriating at times when you're constantly trying to find I identify as an African person. Yes, I am Creole community, I am Black, but that's how I truly identify. And I'm constantly looking for that, and I keep getting Europe the farther and farther back I go, because their records were documented, right? And a lot of our records weren't. And so even with that background I have, there's still a lot of things I don't know. And it's frustrating. But I would encourage people who have that to use what you have and hold on to it. For example, when I was this makes me emotional, but when I was doing my research for my dissertation, I came across this article on the earliest cattle ranching families in Louisiana. And there were 3 families in that part of Louisiana. 2 of them, those names are in my family. And those were 2 of the European groups in my family tree, Berard and Grevenberg, okay? Belgian for the Grevenberg, and then Berard for the French part. Like, I'm not trying to do a family history project when I'm writing my dissertation, but because, like you said, it's so personal and it's so connected to who I am, that's what I came across. And I was mad because, you know, for one, I'm like, these are the people that enslaved us. These are the people that raped my female ancestors. Yeah, and then to top it off, it was saying things like, oh, you know, these people never did those types of things. They never, you know, procreated with their enslaved. I'm like, that's a lie. Because I have proof that they haven't, right? So those types of things they're really hurtful to find, especially when you're not necessarily looking for them. But because of that record, I was able to get confirmation on my African roots and say, okay, I know that these people were likely Hausa because they were working with horses, right? That's what the Hausa people did in the region of Louisiana. And I know that on that side of the family, in particular, I am Hausa. So it actually was confirmation, but I had to kind of not get over it, but I had to work through that frustration, that emotional part of it to be able to get to what I was meant to see. So sometimes even if you don't necessarily have something that seems directly important or what you're looking for, it may be something that you need to see to get you to somewhere else. I think also in terms of just the general practice of genealogy, look for every single record you can find. Every vital record, birth certificate, death certificate, every church record, marriage, baptismal, depending on the religion. And you'll be surprised what you come up with. You would really be surprised. I have an ancestor that was coming out of Mauritius in the Indian Ocean. And I don't remember exactly how I came across this, but my aunts researched that. I don't know how they came across it, but they did. They got the whole record. But I think I had typed, somebody was telling me, oh, I was just talking about it. And I was telling them the last name, which is Orphe, Orphe. And I was saying the last name is Orphe. They're like, oh, like the street. I said, there's a street called Orphe? I said, they're like, yeah, St. Martinville. I said, oh, I'm in St. Martinville all the time. I've never seen the street. So I Googled Orphe Street just one day. I was like, just something told me to Google it. And I found out that my family helped build that whole area up. That's why the name Orphe was given to the street. But I never knew that. And that's my whole family. So I think sometimes we have to just use what we have and stay encouraged, even if it doesn't seem like anything is revealing itself to you or you're not able to find something. Because I just one day Googled something that I had already known about, like I had already known that name for years. I mean, I grew up knowing the Orphe name, but I just Googled it one day and this whole information came up because I looked up for that particular street that somebody just so happened to mention to me just because I mentioned the part about Mauritius. Literally. But had I not even just verbalized that, I probably would have never known it. So just stay encouraged, utilize those methods I told you. And also in terms of connection, in terms of your own identity, that's for you to decide. You know, I identify with my roots. You know, I grew up that way. I grew up with being called, you know, African and Creole and Black equally, because my family was very pro-Black. They grew up in the Black Power era. My dad had been to Africa a few times, so I grew up with that understanding. And as I've grown in my own spiritual practice and my own research, I even more so identify with being an African person. You know, but there are people who in my community are gonna always only identify with being Creole or Black, and that's also okay, or African American. I think it's really depending on the person and what they feel connected to. You know, some people feel connected to America. I don't really feel that connected to America for many reasons. So, you know, I'm not gonna identify with that first, but I think that's up to each person to determine. I don't think it's anything wrong with how people choose to identify. But I know for me, those are my ancestors. I wanna stay connected to them, because I can't, not to get too spiritual, but I can't spiritually call rapists my ancestors. I just can't do that. Because if I'm calling you my ancestor and I'm putting a shrine up to you and you raped her, how does that look? I can't consider that an ancestor, right? I can say that's a person that contributed to my gene pool, right? But ancestors have more of a spiritual meaning than we think in terms of your particular practice. So I hope that answered your questions or kind of commented on some of the things you brought up, because I said a lot. Yeah. And then wait, do you know if with your family was religious practice was?
I mean, my mom she's very religious in the sense of being like a Black Baptist one. My dad's side is more Lutheran.
Oh, interesting.
I'm engaging with Islam.
Okay.
Because I feel like, I guess, similar to, I have a lot of friends who are Muslim as well.
Okay.
I've been able to learn more about it as well as being an APD major, and I feel like it censors itself mostly in the sense of Afrocentricity for me.
Okay. And the reason why I asked you that is because if you look at those records, sometimes the church records are your go-to, depending on the religious background. Like you go back far enough, that can carry you through some research.
My family, they're from Natchez, Mississippi on my mom's side.
Oh, yeah.
And on my dad's side, my grandfather, New York City, but his ancestors are the Caribbean ones, and then my
Okay.
grandmother is Little Rock, Arkansas.
Okay, yeah. So you got some starting points. Just keep it up, because even when it seems like it's you're hitting a roadblock, something's gonna give. I promise you. Because otherwise, this film would have been done. Are we at time? Or do we have another question?
I had the genealogy.
Oh, you did? The same one?
I was gonna ask about your process of doing genealogical research, and how that is kind of, and also I was going to ask about like, if in your research, did you encounter other people's practices in maintaining their family histories? And, you know, what kinds of systems did you see them maintaining in terms of, making sure that their family histories continue on?
That's a good question. I think a lot of what I saw was oral. A lot of it was oral. You know, grandma said this and daddy said that. Very little of it was written, but a lot of it was told through the cultural practices. So like, you know, for example, when you're learning how to deal with herbs, the stories behind that. You know, when I used to work, for example, with my grandpa in the garden, I used to hate it. Oof, I hated it. It'd be hot. But I think about that's when he told us stories about family. And people would say things like that. Okay, yeah, I learned how to dance on Zydeco on my daddy's feet. You know, so they were telling me stories about family through cultural practices. So I think a lot of our, it's not just simply oral, like in the, I'm just talking, but it's something that's passed down through our cultural practices. You know, so whether that's music or, because when you talk about the washboard, you got to give the history of the washboard. You got to say, how did this come to be? Who learned you, like they say? Who taught you how to play the washboard. That all kind of comes. My great-grandfather on my mom's, well, one of my great-grandfathers on my mom's side, my grandmother would tell us on the porch, he had a whole theory behind Creole. Okay, this is a man born with the 1890s. He had a whole theory. His theory was, you see that? It's my grandma used to tell me, that's what you call lamb black. You'd be walking down the street, lamb, like the animal. That's what you call lamb black. He'd be like, you see that? That's what you call damn black. Right? That's what my grandma said her grandpa used to tell her these stories. And he would say, but we all Creole. That's what he would say. Don't matter. Lamb black was very white skinned, damn black was very dark skinned. So he was saying it didn't matter your complexion, you were all from the same root. That's what he was saying in so many words, but because, you know, my grandmother sat down and talked to us. So I think a lot of people had these stories, you know, these practices that help pass on family history. Very few people that I talked to were keeping like written records that they were writing themselves, but they have like pictures and, you know, like wedding invitations and things like that, you know, like the archives, you know, of the family. Everybody have a mural of photos in the house and that's so-and-so and everybody can tell you who it is. So I think it was more so past through practices. I know for me, I use a lot of, there are a lot of ways, let me just say it in general, there are a lot of ways to keep up with the family history. Talking to people is the first one, asking questions, ask everything you can ask, and you record everything you can, like record it. Because you'll be surprised that some people have suppressed memories and nobody's ever asked them the question. They be waiting, like just waiting. They don't even know they're waiting for somebody to ask them. And they'll talk all day, you just let them, just keep talking, just let the recorder play, you know? And then also, you at yourself gathering whatever you can gather from family, like photos, just important documents, military records. And also if you're spiritual, there's divination. So I don't want to get too much into the spirituality part because everybody has their own beliefs, but if you are a spiritual person practicing African spirituality in general, there's ways you can communicate with ancestors who will tell you things that you won't be able to find on your own. And that's just real. You may not be able to get that if you're not tapping in spiritually, but that's the truth. You can get that through divination. You can get that through dreams, through messages. The question is, are you okay with getting that? Because they're ready for you. If you're ready for them, but they will reveal things to you. So it's not all lost. If somebody dies, it doesn't mean it's all gone. I tell it to one of my friends, her grandmother passed, and she was like, oh, I didn't get to ask her all the questions. I was like, it's okay. She's not gone, really. She's still alive spiritually. Just, you know, remember that. She's not physically here, but her spirit is. So, you know, not to get too much into that, but just know it's not the end all be all when somebody does, you know, transition. It's not the end. Okay. Thank you all. Thank you.
I'm just sending in the chat.
Thank you all for coming. There's an event on March 1st titled Building Community with Justice Patricia Espat. It's a hybrid event, and it's hosted by the Center for Community Health Equity. So you can have all those details in an email afterwards, but I really appreciate everyone for coming.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you, Dr.
I want to say thank you. I'm like, oh, thank you.